This is homework set 17, solving quadratic equations. Question number 1 says to solve this equation. Now it doesn't look quadratic, but if we factor that x out, right? I got 3 x's here, 1 here. If we factor that x out, I'll get x squared minus 9 equals 0. And now I can see this quadratic right here. So that is the difference, right? The difference of two squares. So we have a form for that. Write our parentheses. Set it equal to 0. And unsquare each one. Make 1 plus, 1 minus. And now by the zero factor property, we have a product of this x plus 3, and this x minus 3. One of them has to be 0. So just ask yourself, what's going to make this one 0? This one is, all right, so here's what we'll get. 0, that comes from that one. What's going to make that 0? Negative 3. What's going to make this one 0? Positive 3. There we go. There's our 3 solutions, and this is cubic. So I'm expecting 3 solutions. Now, I did take kind of a shortcut here. If I come back to this point right here, here's what I have. I have that x could be 0, or this x plus 3 could be 0, or that x minus 3 could be 0. Now, this equation here is already solved. Can you solve this one? Yeah, you're going to subtract 3 from each side. So you get x equals negative 3. And then this equation here, you're going to add 3 to each side. So you get x equals plus 3. So here's where our solutions really come from, is I'm solving 3 individual equations. But it's so straightforward, you can probably see it up here. What's going to make each factor 0? What's going to make x 0? 0. What's going to make this thing 0? Negative 3. What's going to make this one 0? Positive 3. In question 2, I see a 3 common here, so I'm going to take that 3 out. And if I take that 3 out, what's left is x squared minus, now negative 6 divided by 3 is 2 equals 0. Now, this doesn't factor, so what are we going to do? I've got this factor and this factor multiplied together, giving me 0. So one of them's got to be 0. It's not the 3. All right, so the only way this can be 0 is to have that x squared minus 2 equals 0. Now, add 2 to each side. So add 2 to each side. We'll get x squared equals 2. And even though we haven't done this yet, we're still going to do it here. I'm going to take square roots of each side. Square root of x squared, this is going to be absolute value of x equals square root of 2. Now, what can you put in for x? So the square root of x squared, we'll talk about this in more detail, but the square root of x squared is the absolute value of x. Now, what can you put in here to get square root of 2? When you remove the absolute value, this is where you're going to get plus or minus. So you could put in positive square root of 2 or negative. Oh, I put the negative in the wrong place. Let me try that again. Positive square root of 2 or negative square root of 2. There are our 2 solutions. Question 3, we've got a trinomial here. But look, 3's are common all through those terms. So let's factor out that 3. Now doing so will leave me x squared plus x minus 2 equals 0. Now, looks like we got a quadratic here. Let's write our sets of parentheses, anticipating we can do this. So what are we going to put in here? How are you going to get that x squared? Just as we always do, x and x. And now, what will we put in these 2 positions here? Well, whatever I put in has to multiply to give me a 2. So it's got to be, there's only one way to get a 2 and a 1. Now, notice that that 2 is negative, right? It's minus 2. So these 2 numbers, when I multiply together, if I get a negative, have to have opposite signs. So what do? I take that middle plus sign and I put it with the larger product. Now look what I've done here. The inner product is 2x. The outer product is only 1x. This inner product is bigger than the outer product. So I'm going to put that plus sign here. That'll give me plus 2x, and then minus x is plus x. And now I can read off the solutions. What is going to make this 0? I've got this times this times this. One of them's got to be 0. It's not the 3. Could be this one, or it could be this one. Now, if you go through all the steps, you'd be writing this. X plus 2 could be 0, or x minus 1 could be 0. And then you solve these equations, right? You subtract 2, so you get x equals negative 2. And then you add 1, so you get x equals 1. Or typically what we just do is this. You can look at this and just take the opposite of this number, right? What's going to make this thing 0? It's going to be the opposite of this. Negative 2 plus 2. Opposite of this. Positive 1 minus 1. So we just usually go from here to here. Question 6, let's solve x squared equals 64. Now, here's how I'm going to solve these. We're going to get everything on one side, 0 on the other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by subtracting that 64. So it's going to look like this. X squared minus 64 equals 0. And now do you recognize this? I've got a square, a difference, and a square, right? What's the square root of this one? X. What's the square root of this one? 8. So I can factor this as the difference of two squares. Set the two parentheses, and then don't forget the 0. Now it's going to be x and x unsquare. We'll get 8 and 8, make 1 plus, 1 minus. And now I'm multiplying this by this. One of them's got to be 0. What's going to make this one 0? Just take the opposite sign. Negative 8 plus 8, right? So I'll get x equals negative 8 from this one. And from this one, opposite of this one, I'll get positive 8. There's our two solutions. And I know there's only two solutions because this is quadratic, right? Second degree, exactly two solutions. Now question 5, I'm going to solve this by just taking square roots of both sides. I have a square on this side, a number on this side. Just take the square root of each side. I'll get square root of a squared equals square root of negative 9. Now on the left side, the square root of a squared is the absolute value of a, and that's going to be, now that's a 9. So what do you have? You have a square root of a negative, so the first thing you do is take the I out. Now, square root of 9, we just happen to know. So I'll get absolute value of a is equal to 3i, and then when you remove the absolute value, you get plus or minus. Because what can I put in here? I could put in 3i or negative 3i. So I am going to get a is equal to negative 3i or positive 3i. Now, back on question 4, I could have done that same thing over here. I could have, if I started out with x squared equals 64, I could have just taken the square roots of each side. Square root of x squared is absolute value of x. Square root of 64 is 8. Remove the absolute values, negative 8, 8. Or, sometimes we could write this. X is plus or minus 8. Or, up here on this one, I could write a equals plus or minus 3i.